So ladies and gentlemen, there's a couple things. If you remember when we were talking about our imaginary numbers, going back to that chapter, what we went over, sorry, Mallory. If you remember, we kind of went over, if you guys remember, the square root of -1, we gave a value of I, right? And then what we kept on working on is if I kept on multiplying, if I did the square root of -1, if I squared that, if I multiplied by itself, right, which would pretty much be like I squared, which equals -1. Okay? And then we just kind of followed that pattern and said, what if I multiplied it by I to the -1, cubed? If or I cubed, well, then that equaled -I. And then I to the 4th equaled +1. And so what we figured out by doing this is this pattern keeps on repeating each other, or itself. So we have I to the first power. Mallory, I'm going to have to ask you to move if you can't have this down, because you have this written down, right? All right, so you have I to the first equals, I to the first power is your I squared equals -1, I cubed equals -I, and I fourth equals 1. Now, we went through this. I'm not going to go through the whole deal again. But if you guys need to know, this keeps on repeating each other. So I to the 5th is going to go back to I to the 6th is -1. I to the 7th, I to the 8th is going to be back at 1. So it keeps on repeating each other. So what we're going to do is, we know there's a repetition every 4th time, right? Every single time you go through 4, you have a repetition. So if I say what's I to the 54th, what I want to do is remove as many repetitions as I can. So we know it takes 4 terms and then it repeats, right? Yes? So how many repetitions then are in 54? So what I do is I say, all right, 54 divided by 4. Because remember, 4 terms is a repetition. So 54 divided by 4, how many times is 4 divided into 54? 13 times, right? So it goes in there 13 times. That means my 4, it keeps on repeating 13 times, and then there's a remainder, right? So 4 divided by 13 is going to be 13, and with the remainder of what? Well, 13 times 4 is going to be 52, right? So there's a remainder of 2. So
Why do you put remainder?
I'm just writing because it's going to be 13 and 2 4s with 13.5. Because what we want to do is, do you understand that 4 divides into 54 13 even times? And there's a remainder of 2. Because 13 times 4 equals 52. Right? But we're trying to see how many times is 13 going to 54. So there's a remainder of 2. Right? But 4 doesn't evenly divide into 2. So what you do is you take your remainder, which I'm writing here, which is my remainder 2, and that's going to be my exponent. Because it repeated itself 13 times, right? 13 goes into 54. It repeated itself 13 times, and there's a remainder of 2 more left over. So that's going to be my exponent. Then we go back to our clock and say, all right, I squared, well, that equals -1. So this answer, I to the 54th, is equivalent to I squared, which is equivalent to -1. All right? So it will be important when you guys are looking at this to make sure you know your first 4 values of I. And then just remember, you're just going to divide your power by 4. And then whatever the remainder is, that's going to be your power for your I. And just simplify it. OK?